There is a point in some transitions where your energy begins to withdraw before you consciously decide anything. You still show up. You still answer messages. You still participate. But something fundamental has shifted in how much of you is actually there. It can be confusing because nothing dramatic has happened. No argument, no clear rupture, just a gradual thinning of emotional investment. Conversations feel slightly harder to stay present in. Certain relationships begin to require more effort than they used to, even though nothing obvious has changed. This is often the first sign, not of separation, but of resonance fading. When your inner world changes, the bonds that were fed by the old version of you start receiving less energy. Not as punishment, not as avoidance, simply because the source they were connected to is no longer producing the same frequency. Most relationships are sustained by an unspoken contract, a shared rhythm, a mutual exchange of attention, validation, availability. When that contract stops being renewed internally, the connection weakens on its own. You don't have to do anything. The system adjusts. This phase can feel lonely, even if you're still surrounded by people. Because the loneliness isn't about absence. It's about mismatch. Being with others while no longer meeting them from the same place. There's a particular kind of sadness that comes with this. Not grief for a loss that has already happened, but an awareness that something is slowly ending. And that awareness often arrives before the separation does. As this continues, something else begins to surface. You realize that certain people don't seem to recognize you anymore. Or rather, they recognize you less easily. The usual dynamic feels off. Your responses don't land the same way. Your presence doesn't generate the same reactions. This can be disorienting. You may start wondering if you've changed too much, if you've become distant or cold. But often, what's actually happening is that an old mirror has cracked. People relate to us through roles as much as through intimacy. The listener, the pleaser, the fixer, the one who adapts. When those roles begin to collapse, the relationship loses its familiar shape. Some people don't know how to connect outside of the version of you that served a function in their lives. Not out of malice, out of limitation. Their bond with you was organized around access to your energy, your availability, your emotional labor. When that access changes, confusion follows. Being misunderstood during this phase is common. You may feel seen as different in ways that don't reflect how you experience yourself, or accused of changing when, internally, it feels more like you're finally not forcing something anymore. The pain here isn't rejection. It's the realization that some connections were more conditional than you knew. As your boundaries strengthen, often without conscious effort, certain exits begin to happen naturally. You give less. You overextend less. You stop explaining yourself as much. You become less accessible in subtle ways. And suddenly, people drift. It can be tempting to interpret this as failure, as loss, as something you did wrong. But boundaries don't remove people. They reveal dynamics. Those who benefited most from your overgiving often resist the moment you stop. Not because they want to hurt you, but because the relationship was structured around what you provided rather than who you were. This is where dependency often masquerades as closeness. When connection weakens, the moment accessibility decreases, something important is being shown. You don't need to confront it. The system resolves itself. Your nervous system plays a crucial role here. Long before you can explain why, your body begins to react differently to certain people. You may feel drained after interactions that used to feel neutral, tense without knowing why, relieved when distance appears. This isn't imagination. The body registers relational alignment through safety cues: ease, contraction, expansion. When peace becomes a requirement rather than a luxury, incompatibilities become harder to ignore. Sometimes the clearest signal comes after someone leaves, a noticeable softening, a release of tension you didn't realize you were carrying. The absence feels lighter than the presence did. That contrast tells the truth. Not every connection is meant to last. Some exist for a season, to teach, to reflect something back to you, to help you develop certain capacities. When the lesson completes, the connection often dissolves without drama. Holding on beyond that point doesn't deepen love. It delays the next chapter. Still, letting go isn't easy. Familiar pain has a strange comfort to it. The brain prefers predictability, even when it hurts. Nostalgia steps in wearing a softer mask, convincing you that what was familiar was also right. Loneliness can feel more frightening than misalignment at first. At least misalignment comes with company. Freedom asks you to meet yourself without certain reference points. This is why there is often an impulse to rebuild the old dynamic, to reach out, to re-explain, to restore what used to work. Not because it was aligned, but because it was known. But underneath that impulse is a deeper fear, not of losing them, but of meeting who you become without them. Space changes you. It returns energy. It restores self-respect. It makes room. Removal, in this sense, isn't punishment. It's redirection. A clearing process that doesn't require bitterness or blame, just honesty. You don't have to decide how to feel about it yet. Recognition comes before acceptance. For now, it's enough to notice that something is reorganizing, that certain bonds are loosening because they no longer match the person you're becoming. This isn't the end of connection. It's the end of connection that required you to stay smaller than you are now. There is often a quieter layer beneath the initial loosening of relationships, one that doesn't announce itself immediately. After the distance appears, after the relief mixes with sadness, there comes a period where you begin to notice how much energy has been returning to you without effort. Not excitement, not happiness, just availability. You wake up with a little more internal space. Your thoughts don't feel as crowded. Your body carries less tension through the day. And only then do you realize how much of yourself had been oriented outward, calibrating constantly to maintain connection. This realization can be uncomfortable. It reframes the loss. What you thought was mutual closeness now reveals itself as constant output, attention, adjustment, emotional labor. None of it malicious, none of it necessarily wrong, just unsustainable for who you are now. There's a temptation at this stage to romanticize the past, to remember only the good moments, to soften the edges of what drained you. Memory does this naturally. It edits for coherence, not truth. But the body remembers differently. It remembers the subtle tightening before certain conversations, the fatigue that lingered after interactions you couldn't explain, the sense of obligation disguised as care. These signals didn't mean the connection was bad. They meant it had reached its limit. When people leave at this stage, it can feel abrupt from the outside. To others, it may look like withdrawal or coldness. Internally, it feels more like honesty catching up. You are no longer negotiating your boundaries in silence. And boundaries, once embodied, don't argue. They don't justify themselves. They simply change what is possible. This is often when people around you react in unexpected ways. Some may try to pull you back into the old dynamic, using familiarity as leverage. Others may express confusion, disappointment, even subtle resentment. Not because you harmed them, but because the relationship no longer operates on the same terms. It can be painful to witness this, especially if you still care, especially if you don't want to be seen as someone who abandons or withholds. But growth disrupts systems that relied on your consistency in a particular role. You begin to see which connections were flexible and which were fragile. Flexible connections adjust. They find new ways of relating. They don't demand access to the version of you that no longer exists. Fragile ones collapse when the structure changes, because they were never built to evolve. This distinction is not a judgment. It's information. Your nervous system responds to it immediately. Around certain people, your breath deepens, your shoulders drop. Around others, your body braces before your mind catches up. This contrast becomes sharper now, harder to ignore. Peace stops being something you earn later. It becomes a baseline requirement. This doesn't make you selfish. It makes you precise. Still, there is grief here. Real grief. Not just for the people who leave, but for the imagined future you carried with them. The version of life where everyone stayed, where growth didn't require distance, where alignment didn't come with loss. Letting go of that image hurts, because it was never guaranteed, but it felt possible. And yet, holding on out of fear keeps you anchored to a past configuration, a configuration that can't support what's emerging. Some connections exist to bring you to a threshold, not to cross it with you. When the lesson completes, repetition stops. If you try to force continuation, the same patterns resurface, only louder. Life doesn't punish here. It insists. The hardest part is that the ending doesn't always come with clarity. Sometimes there is no final conversation, no clean explanation. Just distance that grows until it becomes undeniable. This ambiguity can be painful. The mind wants narrative closure. It wants to know who was right, who was wrong, what it all meant. But meaning doesn't always arrive on your preferred timeline. What does arrive is space. Space for energy to move differently, for new dynamics to enter without competing with old ones, for relationships that don't require you to shrink, explain, or overextend just to remain connected. This is why removal is not the opposite of love. It's the end of a certain kind of attachment. You don't need to harden yourself to survive this. You don't need to become distant or cynical. The process itself sharpens discernment without closing the heart. Over time, you may notice that the people who remain or arrive later meet you differently. There is less effort, less negotiation, less need to prove or perform. The connection feels cleaner, even if it's quiet. This doesn't mean it's easy. It means it's aligned. What's being asked of you now is not detachment, but trust. Trust that the clearing is not emptying your life, it's reorganizing it. Some absences are not losses, they are openings. And while it may still feel tender, there is something undeniably stabilizing about no longer feeding bonds that required you to abandon yourself. You are not becoming less connected. You are becoming more exact about where your energy belongs. This shift can feel isolating in a world that equates connection with constant interaction. But something inside you knows the difference now between proximity and presence. Presence costs less. There's also a subtle recalibration happening in how you experience time. Without certain relational pressures, moments stretch, days feel less compressed. You may realize how much urgency was generated externally, not organically. This slower tempo can feel uncomfortable at first, like you're falling behind some invisible schedule. But gradually, another realization forms. You were never meant to keep pace with everything you were trying to keep. Letting that sink in doesn't come with relief immediately. It comes with honesty, about limits, about capacity, about what you can actually sustain without losing yourself. And then there is identity again. Not the dramatic collapse from before, but something quieter. You begin to notice that you're no longer defining yourself as much in relation to others, not as a reaction, not as a role. There's more, I am, without a following clause. This can feel strangely empty at first, but it's a different kind of emptiness. Not absence, but openness. Space that hasn't been assigned yet. It's tempting here to rush into meaning, to label this as growth or awakening or independence. But naming it too quickly can freeze it into something smaller than it is. This phase doesn't need to be understood yet. It needs to be allowed. There will still be moments of missing, moments where you want to reach back, to check if something could still work if you adjusted just a little. Those impulses don't mean you're wrong. They mean you're human. Attachment doesn't disappear all at once. It loosens in layers. What matters is that you notice when reaching back would require you to leave yourself behind again. That awareness changes the choice, even if the feeling remains. Over time, you may realize that the loneliness you feared is not what you're experiencing. What you're experiencing is solitude, and solitude behaves differently. It doesn't consume you. It gives something back. It gives clarity without force. It gives rest without collapse. It gives you access to yourself without negotiation. And slowly, without ceremony, new relational possibilities begin to appear. Not as replacements, as responses. People who meet you where you are, not where you used to be. Conversations that don't require you to contract or perform to remain included. You don't need many of these. A few are enough. The most important shift, though, happens internally. You stop measuring your worth by who stays. You stop interpreting distance as failure. You begin to trust that alignment carries its own intelligence. This doesn't make the process painless. It makes it coherent. What you're living through is not abandonment. It's refinement, a narrowing that creates depth, a clearing that restores direction. Nothing has gone wrong. Something has become more precise. And you are learning how to live from that precision, one quiet adjustment at a time. There is also a moment, usually later, when you begin to notice how silence behaves differently now. It no longer feels like a void that needs to be filled. It feels more like a pause that belongs to you. At first, this can be unsettling. Silence used to be something you escaped from, something that made you restless. Now it lingers, not demanding anything, just present. In that silence, certain questions surface without urgency. Not the dramatic kind, simple ones, almost quiet enough to miss. Questions like whether you actually miss specific people, or whether you miss the version of yourself that existed when they were there. Whether the absence feels painful or merely unfamiliar. These distinctions matter more than they seem, because sometimes what we grieve isn't the relationship itself, but the structure it provided, the sense of continuity, the reassurance of being known in a particular way. When that disappears, the nervous system reaches for substitutes, old habits, old contacts, old dynamics that promise to restore a familiar rhythm. Resisting that pull takes more strength than starting something new. It requires staying with uncertainty without immediately anesthetizing it. There may be moments where you feel oddly transparent, as if there's less buffering between you and the world, less performance, less armor. You might notice that you speak less, but with more precision, or that you listen differently, not scanning for cues, not preparing responses in advance. This can feel like shrinking, but it isn't. It's concentration. Your energy is no longer spread across as many relational obligations. It gathers, and gathered energy behaves differently. It becomes noticeable to you first, as a subtle increase in self-trust, as a reduced need to explain yourself internally, as a quieter confidence that doesn't seek reinforcement. Still, this phase isn't clean. Doubt returns, often unexpectedly. You might wake up one day convinced you were too rigid, too distant, too unwilling to compromise. The mind revisits old narratives, replaying memories selectively, searching for evidence that letting go was a mistake. This is not regression. It's integration testing. The psyche checks old attachments one last time, not to pull you back, but to see if they still have power. When they don't, the pull weakens on its own. You may also notice how your tolerance for certain emotional exchanges has changed. Drama feels louder. Emotional intensity without depth feels exhausting. Conversations that revolve around complaint or reassurance loops feel harder to stay in. This isn't judgment. It's alignment asserting itself quietly. At the same time, you might find yourself craving fewer but more grounded connections. Not necessarily deeper in a dramatic sense, but more real, less transactional, less performative. You may prefer being with someone in silence over being with many people in motion.